Hi, Misha here, and with new Swiss guns finally coming in, thanks to Sand Imports JDI, I thought it would be fun to do an overview video looking at basically their general issue infantry rifle. Of course, we've covered these quite a bit, but we haven't mentioned the old Schmidt-Rubins and whatnot in some time. So, yeah, let's do that. Starting off with the original, working through its updates and some carbines, and of course the famous K-31, then the Stgw 57, or rather PE 57, and then again kind of coming back to the Stgw 90 and all of that. Now these span a 130-year window. So if you notice, they're not exactly in for a lot of change in a lot of different guns. However, typically when they do adopt a gun, it's ahead of the curve and of course is very well built. Also very expensive, but Switzerland is in a situation where they can afford to do that. Other nations not so fortunate. Of course, their neutrality dates back centuries and has been affirmed again and again, especially since the Napoleonic Wars. Since that time, they've maintained their sovereignty, and a lot of that has to do with the fine weapons and marksmanship, and the fact that pretty much every adult between the age of 18 and 60 can be called upon to serve. Quite a great deterrent, and during the time span of all of these guns, an effective one. Even throughout World War I and World War II, Switzerland remained neutral and therefore uninvaded. So we'll talk about the mechanics and the evolution a bit. And as always, this is just an overview video, but of course there's not really much service to talk about because only really one of these has ever really been used in true combat. So with that, let's just jump right in with the exceptionally ahead of its time Schmidt-Rubin Cavalry Model 1889. It all begins with this rifle here, the Schmidt-Rubin Cavalry Model 1889, firing the Cavalry Patron GP90 7.5 by 53 cartridge, round-nosed. And this was kind of a collaboration in a way of the two designers, Rudolf Schmidt and Eduard Rubin, both of which had been in the Swiss firearms design field for a number of years, and both of which had kind of been working on their respective projects for some time. For Schmidt's part, he designed the action, although it was heavily influenced by the Swiss's Vetterli. It was quite unique to itself. And Schmidt also worked on and designed the magazine feed here, although he definitely took inspiration from James Paris Lee of Enfield fame. Rubin, for his part, was on the cartridge side. He had been interested in small diameter cartridges, anything from 7 to 8 millimeter, and in the 1880s was working with compressed black powder, which I've shown a couple of guns that originally would have fired that, including the Steyr-Mannlicher 1888. That was kind of the newest thing at the time. And by 1885, these two had been pretty well paired up. And then, of course, France released the Lebel cartridge, the 8mm 8x50 Lebel, to the world. And the Model 1886 rifle to fire it. Now the rifle was nothing to really write home about, but the cartridge or smokeless powder, even in its earliest form, really was. Now, a lot of nations had recently, or just on the verge of adopting new weapons. Now, in England, they had the Lee Metford, which they hastily reworked from 303 black powder to 303 smokeless powder. They had issues, which is why the Lee Enfield came to be. Well, in Switzerland, luckily the Schmidt action was quite strong, and they could handle it. And also, luckily, Rubin had been working very hard with the small diameter cartridge, so it was not a huge change to replace the compressed black powder with the new smokeless in it. There, of course, had to be some last-minute changes, because the design was pretty well good to go by late 1887, early 1888. Thus, the rifle was adopted in 1889, and the cartridge would lag a little behind in 1890. In these first few years, production was very low, more for, testing and trials and what have you. By late 1891, they'd built maybe 25,000, and the very first rifles were starting to hit the field. By 1892, production was getting on to be full swing, although they had some early difficulties, mostly because Bern and Sig weren't cooperating fully. And they started to really be seen in numbers in the field by 1893. And between that time and when production was halted in 1897, they would build about 212,000 for the military, and maybe a small number more for private purchase. So, most of you know the features of this critter, but let's talk about a few interesting ones. This is not a small or a light rifle. It's over 51 inches long with a 31-inch barrel, and it's over 10.5 pounds. But it was very advanced for its day and time, especially when you compare it to rifles like a Lilibelle, okay, the 1886, but you know what I mean, the Lee Metford, even the Mosin Nagant, which was adopted a couple of years later. For a first-generation smokeless powder gun, it did very well, especially one that was initially created to be black powder. To that end, we have, of course, the very famous straight pull system, the ring style safety, the beer keg kind of rubberized cocking handle. We have a lightning cut receiver. We have very long-ranged sights out to 2,000 meters here. Very easily adjustable. Full-length stock with grasping grooves. Full-length, well, nearly full-length top handguard. Actually very advanced for the day and time, the grooves in the handguard. Pretty standard front sight that is drift adjustable. No cleaning rod, no clearing rod, but we do have a stacking rod and a bayonet lug. We have bottom mounted sling swivels, and we have a very unique magazine that holds 12 rounds, and if that's not enough, you can actually load a 13th without it. And the way it was done, we have a feed cutoff. Up was turning the magazine off, which moves it down, so single shot, and it might seem odd that down activates the mag, but in combat it's a lot easier to flick down to activate your mag than to flick up to activate it. So ergonomically it makes quite a bit of sense, and is certainly a lot better than a lot of other feed cutoffs we see from this era. For example, again on the Lee Metford and later Lee Enfield. We also have a very nice kind of sewing needle hook trigger, two-stage trigger. and then a curved butt plate and nice wood stock. These were well-made guns, and they were known, at least in the 1890s, along with the GP90 cartridge, for delivering very good accuracy, very good range. Also, they had very good capacity, and they could be fired quite quickly. But of course, they weren't perfect. And one of the earliest problems actually arose because of the cavalry. Here we have the Carabiner Model 1893, or K-93 you should probably hear me call it. And this is the only one in this list that was not designed in Switzerland. So the Schmidt-Rubin here, believe it or not, was initially quote-unquote adopted by the Swiss cavalry. Right. A nearly 11-pound gun that's as tall with its bayonet as some humans was quote-unquote adopted by cavalry. This didn't work, obviously. They did try a few different styles of carbine / short rifle for the Schmidt-Rubin, but this is a very long action and a very bulky magazine. They just never could get it as light and short. Plus, the way the action is made, it's quite hard to operate from horseback or whatnot. It just was not well suited. So, temporarily, from 1890 to 91 or so, they were just continuing to use the old Vetterli 1878. But in 1891, the head of the Swiss cavalry wrote a letter pretty much protesting, saying they too needed a new modern smokeless powder bolt action repeating gun. So in 1893, tests began. They did look at both straight pull and turn bolt designs from Stgw, as well as both straight and turn bolt designs from Steyr in Austria, and they had a modified Mauser pattern they looked at. In the end, they would select the straight pull Steyr-Mannlicher, very similar to the one you probably think of, the M95, although an earlier version based more on the M90 carbine. And it was officially adopted in 1895, hence the name. Well, okay, I should back up. Not really the name, but 1893 being the name when the model was first created, but it was adopted in 1895. And production would commence in Switzerland, not in Austria. Steyr would just make some pre-production and prototypes, and then help Stgw set up production, and they would begin that year, and they would produce about 4,250, give or take, until about 1900. And this was enough to pretty much arm the front line cavalry and meet the immediate need. But because of losses in the field and expansion of the cavalry, in 1896 it was decided that Bern would also produce the K-93, and they would begin by 1897, and they would produce until 1905, although in small numbers, building about 3,500. And these were mostly done in just tiny batches to kind of replace carbines lost in the field, make replacement parts, and once in a while arm new troops and have enough in stockpile and reserve. Meaning total production was around 7,750. So what was wrong with this gun? Well, aside from suffering from the usual not made here stigma, there were some legitimate and maybe not legitimate complaints. The cavalry selected the Steyr-Mannlicher carbine because it was significantly shorter and lighter than the Schmidt-Rubin. It also had, believe it or not, a more durable, stronger straight pull bolt action. It was about 39 inches long, with a 22-inch barrel, so quite respectable for its size. And it weighed under 7 pounds, about 6 3/4 unloaded, so quite a bit lighter and shorter. It was fitted with a 300-meter battle sight, and then it had a flip-up sight leaf here, which started off at 400 meters and would go up to, I believe, 1200. I know, the Swiss selling for only 1200 and a carbine with a barrel under 2 foot. Again, the rifle had a lowest range of 300 meters and would go out to 2000. It had a new pattern of magazine too that was quite easily detachable, but this was really just for maintenance. It was a 6-rounder. Now, one thing I did not mention, on the Schmidt-Rubin, another advancement it had, it was loaded through essentially chargers. Now, I hate to call them stripper clips because they're in between a stripper clip and a Mannlicher clip. You can Google pictures, but they're very interesting paper cardboard design that very well protects the bullet. Anyway, they were 6-rounders, so 2 of them would fill the 12-round mag of the Schmitty here. Well, 1 of them would fill the carbine, so these could be and were topped off with the same clips. And of course, these fired the same 7.5 GP90 ammunition. They had side sling bars, full-length wood stock. They had a full-length upper handguard, and interestingly, it wrapped around behind the rear sight, covering the chamber to better protect the cavalryman in case he's been shooting. And otherwise, the system is quite similar to the Steyr-Mannlicher I'm sure you're familiar with safety here and, again, straight pull bolt. But it is a much shorter system and relatively light. It does have a Swiss style trigger, quite nice. And then it has a protected front sight. No bayonet lug, no stacking rod. So the problems with these. First and foremost, accuracy. Now, I think somewhat they were expecting too much out of a short carbine, frankly, and the GP90 cartridge in it. The biggest thing about accuracy, the Schmidt-Rubin has, like I said, a regular dovetailed adjustable front sight, and the barrel is kind of semi-free-floated because it's not really contacting the handguard here. It just contacts it at the front with the front sight mounted on the barrel, the rear sight, and of course back here. On this is not really a floated barrel at all, and kind of unfortunately, the front sight is more part of the end cap / collar than it is directly contacted to the barrel, and it's really just held on with a screw. So the front sight could and did get loose, which, as you would imagine, especially if you have a 1200 meter rear sight, could throw off your accuracy. The Schmidt-Rubin bolt, while it is large and heavy, is very simple and easy to take out and field strip. The Steyr-Mannlicher bolt is very easy to take out and can be a pain in the ass to get back in, and it can bite your fingertips. The bolt, while it is stronger because of its locking lug arrangement, is more complex and more difficult to work with in the field. I mean, sitting at home on your table in your chair, it may not seem that way, but out in the field, it could be. Therefore, the cavalry were again not terribly satisfied. In fact, many of these guns were accidentally lost or oopsie-daisy broken in the field in hopes they would be issued something else in its place. And so, even though production was always going to be small because the Swiss cavalry is not huge, it was probably smaller than it might have been otherwise, and these were officially retired in 1905 and pretty quickly kind of hustled out of full service. Whereas other Swiss guns, including our 1889, would end up hanging around for quite a long time in one way or another. All that said, I actually really like the K-93. It's an interesting gun, and just an interesting story, and it's rare. And of course they have typical Swiss quality. So despite their shortcomings, probably in many other militaries they would have been better accepted. But the Swiss have a lot of national pride, and they're very big on marksmanship. And it just wasn't the right gun for them. So, what came next? The next stage, the next era in Swiss rifle evolution was an argument over lugs, locking lugs. Here is the original 1889 bolt. Notice that the lugs are quite far in the back here on this collar piece. And here is the 8996 bolt with the lugs at the other end of the collar piece, essentially central in the bolt. So the story. Schmidt had been working on his system throughout the 1880s. And then right as it was about to be adopted, smokeless powder came onto the scene, which delayed it a little bit. Not as much as it would delay the cartridge, but it did. Now, originally these lugs were in the back because of the connection with the Vetterli, and also the fact that it was initially meant to fire smokeless powder. This long stem up here. But I said smokeless, I meant black powder. Compressed black powder, to be fair, which is in some ways even grittier and dirtier than regular black powder. But anyway, as they went to smokeless, they weren't stupid. They recognized that this feature really wasn't useful, and in fact was detrimental. So in 1888, some in the military did ask Schmidt about moving the lugs further forward. And he said, no, leave it alone, it's good as it is. Which seems like a very codgerty thing to do. And it really kept Switzerland, who the 1889 was a very advanced rifle. That one little change would have made it last even 20 years further into the future. But Schmidt, I think he was tired of working on it. He wanted to see it in production. He was getting a royalty, so he wanted the money. I think he was just tired. It was good enough for him. So, while his decision was not very foresightful, it is very human, very understandable. So the 1889 went into production pretty well unaltered when it switched from compressed black powder to smokeless. But this idea of moving the lugs never left. In 1892, a Swiss military officer who was into designing, Vogelsang, was pretty much said, hey, make a proof of concept, try moving the lugs, see what happens. And he did just that. At the end of that year, he delivered a wooden mock-up showing what would happen and what would need to be done to move the lugs forward. And from that, 3 prototypes were ordered, and from there, 50 pre-production rifles were ordered. Now, not a lot happened in 1893, and then in 1894, Rudolf Schmidt retired his post, going into, retirement. Coincidentally, in January of 1895, testing on the new rifle would begin. And what they found through production and whatnot, yes, they could move the lugs forward. And this would have many benefits. You notice the bolt is shorter. It's about 0.8 inches shorter, which allow the receiver to be shorter. And this would make it lighter. It would make it stronger, easier to operate, and even improve accuracy because you have less of a stem. But in some ways, Schmidt was right. It was not a straightforward and easy way to convert the 1889s over to it, because you had to have all different internal cutouts for the receiver. You had to redo the trigger guard, and so on and so forth. So the 1889 could not be converted. A new rifle would be needed, and therefore the new rifle would have a slightly shorter receiver. And they would keep the overall length at about 51 inches by going to a slightly longer stock and ever so slightly relocating the trigger. It would still have a 31-inch barrel. But it would be a little bit lighter because of the receiver. And so, in the summer of 1896, the new pattern was adopted as Cavalry 1889/96, or just the 8996. And then, by early 1897, the original 1889 production was terminated, and the new pattern was put into production in its place. And they would build roughly 137,000 of the new gun. A little more than that, I think 13750 or something. But anyway, a little bit smaller number than the 1889. And they would actually keep the 1889 still in service. Typically, the young, more active units would get the new 8996 rifle, keeping the older units and the more reserve units with the 89 rifle. And it would still be firing GP90, 7.5 by 53. So essentially, it was just a stronger, more dependable action. The 89 was strong enough to handle the smokeless round, but over time, they did have some issues. Again, somewhat with accuracy, but also over a long period of time, this long stem starting to contort, flex, and that can lead to some head spacing issues and even a little bit of gas kind of going around the rim of the cartridge. It's one thing I didn't mention earlier too. The GP90 cartridge, it was a round nose bullet, but it was rimless, which already made it superior to the 8mm Lebel, and kind of put it on an even keel with the 8mm that was used in the German commission rifle, but a little smaller diameter, a little more straight shooting, a little more flat shooting. It was a pretty advanced cartridge, but since it was originally, like the rifle, meant for black powder, it had a few anachronisms as well. So they had improved both a bit in the 1890s, but then at the end of the century, France would yet again kind of change the game, maybe not quite as radically, but still noticeably, by introducing a pointed bullet, Ball D as they called it. We would think of it as Spitzer, and immediately the Swiss were interested because anything that gave them better range, better accuracy was right up their mountain alley. As early as 1903, conceptual work began in Switzerland to develop their own Spitzer bullet, Spitzer cartridge. And then in 1907, Bern would kind of primarily lead the way, and they would test different barrel lengths, different rifling rates, different powders, different bullet shapes, really kind of running the gambit. And they pretty well had it locked down by 1909, and 900 rifles were ordered as a pre-production batch, 100 short rifles, and 100 carbines, carabiners. and these would be for extensive field testing and trials, and really pretty much went off without a hitch. Although the new cartridge and the new rifle would not be adopted until 1911, thus GP Gewehr Patron 11 that you're familiar with. And when I say new rifle, at first it wasn't really that. Unlike with the 1889, the 89-96s could be updated to fire the new Spitzer projectile. So what they would do, they planned to pretty much convert them all, taking them in batches, converting them, and then issuing them back out, taking another batch in. So in the 19-teens, the old 1889s that were in storage were sometimes dusted off and again reissued during this kind of World War I period. So they saw a second life. Now the 1889 technically could fire the GP11 cartridge, but it would quickly break the action, or at least wear it out, and it wasn't terribly accurate because the bore, the chamber, really wasn't configured for it. So to convert the new gun to make what would become known as the Gewehr 9611, they installed an all-new barrel with the new sights already on it from the manufacturer. Pretty much the same front end, bottom sling mounts, and they modified the trigger guard and gave it a new 6-round magazine. So very much inspired, if not the same as, the carbine mag, and again removable. Now the 89 mag is also quite easily removed, but again just for cleaning. But they went away from the 12 shot to just a 6 because it really wasn't worth the extra weight and bulk, and this could still be topped off by the same chargers, the same Swiss chargers, and it had a new feature of holding open on the last round, so when empty, whereas the previous one did not. And of course there's no longer the need for a feed cutoff. And this new magazine saved a little more weight, and by this point we're getting the rifle down. It's still a very heavy and long gun, but at least we're definitely closer to 10 pounds than we are 11 with the original. And one other final change, they grafted this pistol grip, or semi-pistol grip, onto the stock. Originally they were all straight stocks, like here. They dovetailed it and slotted it in. And everything else is pretty well the same. There are some small things you can notice, but of the, 137,089-96 rifles, fewer than 1,300 were not converted. A few were kept for research in museums, but really the most of the ones that weren't converted were ones that were already taken home, sold off to the private citizens after their service, which obviously were not very many because this was still a brand new gun. And they knew this would still not be enough, so they're going to have over 135,000, nearly 136,000, which they would convert from 1911 through about 1913. And then as the Swiss army was expanding because of World War I, they planned to produce 60,000 more fresh, brand new Schmidt-Rubin style guns. And these are the ones known as the Gewehr 1911. Now ultimately they would build over 127,000, with production ending around 1919. They more than doubled this number just because of the expansion, plus they wanted excess amount in stockpiles and inventory in reserve for a just-in-case situation, in case they needed to expand even further because of German belligerency. But of course, once World War I ended, the need kind of also went away. So a lot of them were just put into reserve. Now the 1911 is a very, very, very similar gun. In fact, the barrels are all the same because, again, all new barrels were added to these. There are a few minor differences, mostly internal with the receiver. And of course, while the 1911 does have a semi-pistol grip still, it is integrated with the stock and not grafted on. And the 1911s have a straight butt plate with less of a curve going on. This is very curvy because of the original. So that's usually how I kind of ID them, although it's not a foolproof way. In the end, they pretty much updated them all to the same standard and had quite a large number, over 250,000, in their inventory by the 1920s. And with that, the 1889 was finally, at least nearly so, allowed to retire out. By 1934, the old GP90 cartridge was taken out of service officially. But there was a small brief blip for these again, given to or carried by volunteer home guard type units during World War II, again, German aggression. And then after World War II, finally, around 1947, the Gewehr 1889 was fully and completely retired out of military service. After that time, only appearing in private hands and coming up and shooting competitions and whatnot. But obviously newer guns like the 96 and the 11 were superior, along with their new GP11 7.5 by 55 cartridge. So, with that said, what about carbines and short rifles? After all, this is still sporting the 31-inch barrel, bottom sling swivels, and 2,000-meter rear sight. To continue the story, we actually need to go back a couple of years, so I brought the K-93 back out and to talk about a short rifle and a carbine in the 89-96 series, so still firing GP90. The first was what some would call the Fortress carbine or the Fortress rifle. With the 89-96, we had a slightly shorter receiver, slightly more compacted action, and at this time, the Fortress Guards and other specialist troops wanted something shorter than a 31-inch gun, but the K-93 wasn't to their liking. They didn't feel like it had the range and accuracy they desired. So they ended up adopting a 23-inch barreled version of the 96 action. It was very similar. Basically, they took the 1897 Cadet rifle, which was a single shot, and instead of being a single shot, they plugged in a 6-round mag, if not identical to, at least inspired by the one in this carbine. So it was a 6-shot gun with a 23-inch barrel, kind of more fitting the short rifle definition than anything else. And these were quite popular. They would build 18,750, and they were often just known as the 1889/1900, or just 89/00, or just 1900 short rifle, again sometimes called a carbine. As for the Cavalry, remember I said this carbine was officially retired in 1905. Well, what replaced it was something quite similar, also based on the 96 action. They would go to a carbine with a 21.7 inch barrel, so about an inch and a quarter shorter. But it would take a lot of design cues from this gun, including the stock style, the side sling mounts, the rear sight setup arrangement, even the end cap. Well, I mean, obviously the front sight will be mounted to the barrel, but this style without bayonet lug. And this would be known as the Carabiner 1905, or just K05, or whatever you'd like to call it. And they would build about 7,900, so just a little bit more than this gun here. Meaning that, we have about 26,000 of the two shorter Schmidt-Rubins produced in the early 20th century. So where are they? Why, it's not a huge number, but why do we still have K-93s, but not Fortress short rifles or 1905 Cavalry carbines? Well, kind of for the same reason we don't have 89/96 rifles. Most were converted. The Carabiner 1911, or just K11. Officially, this is a carbine, and it was meant to replace both the Fortress rifle and the Cavalry carbine, and did a pretty good job of both. And they went through pretty much the same process as the 9611 and 1911. Same action. They would convert over 26,000 older guns, including the 1900 and 1905, leaving maybe as few as 300 in the world unconverted. And most of those would be the Fortress rifles. Virtually all of the 1905s were converted. Of course, they have the same 6-shot mag, same pistol grip stock. Now we've gone to a side sling bar that's inletted. You notice this one has a very flat, very straight butt plate. That's the 1911 purpose-built rifles were the same way. Here it is in a cocked position, just because. We have the handguard on the 1911 style here ends with the rear sight, but on the K11, as with earlier carbines, it goes behind and covers the breech. Some grasping groups. This time we have a sling swivel as opposed to just a bar on the side again. And for the fortress, we have a bayonet lug and a piling swivel stacking rod, and we have a new style of protected front sight, which is still nevertheless adjustable. And though it pained the Swiss greatly, the rear sights only go out to 1,500 meters. But hey, it's more than that old ratty K-93, right? And otherwise, yeah, we have pretty well the same action and same gun. This has a 23-inch barrel. Of course, it fires GP11. Overall length is about 43.5 inches. And we weigh in a little under 8.5 pounds. So we're saving about 1.5 pounds from the rifle. And the K11 actually was not put into full production and conversion until 1913, even though prototypes dated all the way back to 1909, as I said. On the other hand, whereas the 1911 rifles, the production was ended in 1919, with the K11, production would still continue sporadically until about 1933. Now, they were not ready yet to adopt a universal short rifle, as America had done with the 1903, and as had Britain done with the Enfield SMLE Mark III. They still nominally had the long rifle for infantry use, and reserved the K11 for cavalry, artillery, bicycle troops, balloon corps troops, signal corps troops, specialists. And early on, people still liked the long rifle because, again, marksman culture. But after World War I, a younger generation started to appreciate the 23-inch barrel version more. So, while the 1911 was still officially the standard, more and more the K11 became the de facto standard, or if not standard, at least the choice amongst many. This was starting to really become a popular size because they realized that they weren't sacrificing a lot in the accuracy department, and it was a lot handier to carry around all day. Now, they did, to be fair, try shorter versions with 21-inch barrels, but with the new Spitzer GP11 cartridge, it was really felt that 23 inches was as short as they wanted to go, not just for accuracy reasons, but also for flash, noise, muzzle rise, etc., etc. So, well, they really didn't intend to. They did kind of end up adopting a short rifle, and they would produce nearly 185,000 purpose-built guns with, like I said, over 26,000 conversions. So they would have nearly as many of these as they built the original 1889 Schmidt-Rubin long rifle, and it was a respectable number even compared with the 1911 long rifle. And it would set the stage for what Switzerland would go to war with, or rather not go to war with, but potentially go to war with in the Second World War. And now we come to the one that most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, and I'm betting many of you own. The Carabiner 1931 K31. And even though it's called the Carabiner, it's actually a short rifle, at least technically speaking. And this would be finally when Switzerland would kind of abandon the notion of having to have a long-barreled infantry rifle for its standard. As I said, the K11 here was gaining in popularity, and at first they wanted a gun that had the size of the K11 but the accuracy of the 1911, and an early effort was actually just to take K11s here and put heavier, not longer, barrels on them. But this wasn't really practical. It didn't give them the accuracy gains they hoped for, and it was kind of cost prohibitive. In 1929, work really began on this rifle at the Bern factory. The military, the Army, wanted something, like I said, with the accuracy of a long rifle but the length of a short rifle or carbine, and they wanted it to be less expensive. Say what you will, there's a lot of good things to be said about the Schmidt-Rubin here, but inexpensive and easy, quick to mass produce, it is not. So, in 1931, in May, The first trials batch of around 200 model 1931s were handed off for testing and were generally very well received. Therefore, in 1932, they were selected for adoption to replace not only the K11, but the 1911 or Cavalry G11, really being the first time in history Switzerland decided to actually go to a shorter barrel length. And in 1933, full production was ramped up. So, what do we have here? Well, obviously, as you know, this isn't really a Schmidt-Rubin. Schmidt would pass away in 1898. Rubin would live a good while longer, passing away peacefully in 1920. So this is, while inspired by their creation, not. Now it would still fire GP11 7.5 by 55. And it still was a straight pull. Still had a 6-round magazine, although it is a new pattern designed for better reliability and faster, easier maintenance compared to the old one here. Boop. Still had a last round hole open, and they were still topped off by the 6-round charger. They did actually experiment with more of a traditional Mauser type feed system, tripper clip, early in the 1911's life, but it didn't go anywhere. We have a full-length upper handguard. And here, aside from, of course, the bolt, which we'll get to in just a second, is the major difference. The K11 has a 23, like 0.2 inch barrel. The K31 has a 25.7 inch barrel. So, about 2.5 inches longer. However, they are both 43.5 inches long. So how is this doable? Well, it has a lot to do with the bolt and the receiver. So, K11 on top, pretty standard Schmidt pattern, although modified by Vogelson. And the new K31 designed to burn on bottom. As you can notice, they are significantly different. The K11 is quite a bit longer, and the lugs are further back here. The K31 lugs are at the very edge of the bolt. This system is stronger, more rigid, therefore better groups. It's also easier to machine. For example, this has a machined op rod section here, whereas this one's made out of plate steel. Also, they went away from the rubberized handle to this alloy one. So use the same basic safety system. Just all in all, a more durable bolt and a cheaper to make one. And this translated to the receivers themselves. They're shorter and lighter. They also, as you see here, this is a lightning cut. They kind of quit doing that. The longer barrel also allowed for a longer sight radius, which is always good for accuracy. And whereas the K11 in 1911 had a semi-floated barrel, the K31 has more of a true floated barrel. This allows for better potential accuracy. It's also actually cheaper, the system they did, with fewer parts. And this barrel is heavier. So we have the side sling mounts. Pretty well the same. Here's our mags again. Just because. Rare. like I said, they still use chargers to load these. Most of the time anyway. Stacking swivel, bayonet lug, still has a hooded front sight. Because of the new heavier barrel that's longer, the K31 is actually a little bit heavier, whereas the K11 was about 8.5 pounds. The K31 is 8 3/4 pounds, maybe a little bit more. Still lighter than the Schmidt-Rubin rifle, but this was meant for standard issue. And they really wanted the range for, again, fortress fighting, mountain fighting, more fixed positions. And that kind of shows the Swiss military. They weren't really marching long distances. They were fighting from fixed defensive fortifications, so weight wasn't important as much. And of course, on the civilian side, the marksman side, they really just wanted the accuracy. And they did go to a new pattern of sight as well. And they updated the trigger. And just other things like that. So yeah, in 1934, like I said, GP90 was officially taken out of service. And after over 40 years, the Schmidt-Rubin was finally replaced in service, although plenty of K11s and even some 1911s would hang on well through World War II. And they would build over 528,000 K31s between the beginning and the end in 1958. And the design in the large scale would not change all that much, but it would fundamentally have a few changes, with the most noticeable being going from walnut to beech wood stocks in 1946. And even though this was more accurate and had a lot going for it over older versions, it was less expensive, hence the larger number produced. Of course, now they're also not having to split production between long rifle and carbine. They can just consolidate all with one. And of course, we're still using the good old GP11 cartridge that was done a generation ago. That is plenty accurate and serves to make the K31 very much a respectable shooter to this day. And of course, this gave rise to several guns like the ZFK-55 sniper rifle and what have you. And many are still used in competition shooting to this day. And in the end, this would be the Swiss Army's final straight pull bolt action short rifle. So now that we've covered all of our straight pull bolt actions, a few thoughts. I mean, these have very, very good triggers. The straight pull action is a little jerky to open up, but you kind of want that buildup of force to have good extraction. Beyond that, they're all made to be as accurate as possible, and the 7.5mm cartridge, it was always known for very good accuracy itself. Now that said, as I said in the intro, these guns are well suited for Switzerland. Accuracy and dependability, and they have this mentality of essentially putting a lot of money in at the outset. A large initial investment in the guns. They are quite expensive to produce, even on a scale like we see here. But the idea is, if we do that, and then each soldier takes them home and individually maintains them, they wanted guns that would not break at least any major parts for decades, and in the case of several of these, centuries. So it was an initial investment, very much a buy once, cry once mentality. That said, these guns are all made to be cleaned regularly and cared for. I don't see them being as successful in the hands of, say, a Russian conscript or a Chinese conscript, especially ones fighting in the mud and dirt in those situations. It's kind of like how the SVT-40 Tokarev rifle wasn't all that well received by the Russians, but the Germans, who at least in 1941 were a little more highly trained, seemed to really love it. But yeah, so it's more interesting to say that this is a very nice gun, but it would not have been well suited for all nations and all needs. So just try to be fair about that. And of course the cost. If you built 20 million K-31s, you'd bankrupt your nation, basically. And into the Cold War era, they would continue kind of the trend. So let's get into those. And with the passage of World War II, Switzerland, like everyone else, really sat up and took note of really developments out of Germany, namely the MP-44, whereas some nations like America went from a bolt action to a self-loading semi-auto like the M1 Garand, and then a select fire like the M14. Others, like Switzerland, jumped directly from bolt action to select fire. And thus enters the SIG SG 510 series. After Bern had kind of taken the lead with the K-31, SIG was back with this critter. And work on a self-loading and or select fire rifle really dated back to World War II and after World War II and into the 1950s in Switzerland, much like they had done when before adopting the P49, the SIG P210. They took their time and really tried a lot of systems out. But by the mid-50s, the kind of forerunner was the AM-55, primarily designed by Rudolf Amsler. And it was based loosely on the MG42, as well as the prototype from Mauser of the Stgw 45M. So that means it was a roller delayed blowback, often just called a roller locked gun, without a gas system. This has many advantages and some disadvantages. And the AM-55 was not really that far off from the final version. It had wood furniture and whatnot, but the basic bones were there. It more or less passed the trials, and then an updated version, the AM-57, became the Stgw 57 Sturmgewehr Model 1957, and officially adopted in 1957 and into full production by 1958, hence why the K-31 would go out of production. Now, even though the K-31 would go out of production in 1958, many would continue to see active service throughout the 60s, and some would appear here and there into the 1970s. So, the 57. We are firing the same 7.5 by GP11 cartridge, so 7.5 by 55. As I said, it's a roller delayed blowback gun. It is select fire though. 3 positions here. Very stiff selector, hard to do single-handed. But they wanted it stiff so it could not accidentally be tripped. We have a reasonable trigger from military service. We have a pistol grip with a small storage compartment. This is made of polymer. We have a rubberized buttstock here with this extension which houses the recoil spring. We have flip-up sights. The rear is adjustable out to 650 meters. Front sight is also adjustable. It also has a small thing on the top for night sight use. For the rear sight, for night sight, there's a clip-on piece. We have a folding carry handle, rubberized front handguard. Then we have a heat, kind of a barrel shroud here, kind of a heat shield. We have a new pattern of bayonet lug finally. And we have a new barrel. This barrel is quite interesting. It is all one piece, made as a single unit. It's 24 inches long. That includes this muzzle brake, which also doubles as a 26mm grenade launcher. I think the actual rifled part of it, or not rifled, but the actual barrel part, if you take this off, is about 22 and a half inches. And it has the same overall length as the K-31, which I'm sure is not by accident, 43.5 inches. But it is heavier, as you might expect with all the extra stuff, at between 12.25 and 12.5 pounds as the full military version here. So she's not light. And it feeds from at least a standard 24 round magazines. Now, whereas the gun is heavy, the mags are actually quite light. They are made out of machined aluminum alloy and will only weigh about a ½ pound each. They're actually quite appealing. Early ones will have a metal follower, later ones can have a polymer follower. Good in the cold. And these are an evolution from Switzerland's LMG 25. Which use 30 round mags. In fact, as far as I know, the LMG 25 mags will work in this gun. They also have a small 6 round mag for use when launching rifles by holding blanks to fling the rifle grenades. And for export, there would be a 20 round mag, although there is debate as if those would work for 7.5. We also have a bipod here, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And we have very easy disassembly with a push pin in the back and a mag catch here. There is no bolt hold open though. Flipping her over, you can note a few other interesting features, including a beer keg charging handle, very clearly inspired from the K-31, and this is non-reciprocating. We also have a very small ejection port. You would not think this would be for 7.5mm. Not nearly big enough. That's because the cartridges actually go out butt first. They get flung out, they get swept out by a very mechanically interesting device. Take down pin. And they actually tried to make this more affordable to mass produce, using a lot of welding, soldering, and more stamped steel and sheet steel. Doing what they could, but in the end it still ended up being the most expensive mass-produced general issue battle rifle of the Cold War era. Imagine if they hadn't tried to make it cheap. Oh, one other feature I can show you from this side. Winter trigger. This was used for mitts. Also was used for when they wanted to launch rifle grenades, so your little finger wouldn't be in there when it went boom and potentially hurt you. So very much a step ahead for Switzerland. And it was designed not just to replace the K-31. Here she is on her bipod. In this role, she would be used for more accurazed fire, for example, to replace the rifle. These were also used to replace various submachine guns in Swiss service, including some Finnish Suomis. Neat thing is this sling hooks on here, but when you need to take it off, you just pull. If I can do it single-handed. And the buckle has this little clip. When you pull, it lets the tension off, freeing up the shroud. Notice how it does not monopod like so many other guns. And you might want to do this because the bipod has a second position. Take a look. And here it is in its forward position. It has a spring-loaded button in the back. It also has one on the front where it clips in. And to unclip it, you rotate it and it comes off. So that's why you want to maybe unhook your sling to let your bipod go forward. And the reason it had this feature, when the bipod is in this position, it can be used more conveniently as a light machine gun, replacing that LMG Model 1925, LMG 25 I mentioned. And while it doesn't have a quick change barrel, again it has 24 round mags, and it had a relatively slow cyclic rate of 450 to 500 rounds. So yeah, maybe not the best LMG, but they were trying. And that was a very popular notion in the 50s, was kind of the universal one-size-fits-all. But it maybe worked a little better for Switzerland because of their citizen army. So they could issue these to the soldiers, and they're still plenty accurate thanks to the 7.5 millimeter and good sights. And they had rate of fire to be used in more of a machine gun role. I think that's also why they went with kind of this straight line buttstock with the sights set up real high. If you notice, it's kind of reminiscent, at least in execution, of the AR-10, AR-15 with its kind of straight line stock and tall sights, but that's to help check recoil. And the mags are light, like I said. We have this carry handle to quickly move it around if you're going from one position to another. And while I'm not going to say it is perfect, it is quite heavy, and it does shoot a pretty powerful cartridge, but thanks to a very stout buffer spring system, kind of nested spring system, it has less recoil than you would think. And what it does have, it shoves straight back into you. It doesn't have a lot of muzzle rise. And I think how the muzzle device is part of the barrel, that was done to keep accuracy, and also because they could. This gun was unique for Switzerland in another way as well. The Schmidt-Rubins and the K-31 were all produced for Swiss use. Some, I'm sure, got out of the country, but they were not actively exported. Not so with the SG-510. Yeah, the military version here, or the Stgw 57, was made specifically for the Swiss Army. But SIG would have many versions. The SG-510-1 was the typical standard version here. The -2 was a lightweight version that was a little over a kilogram lighter with a slimmer shroud. The -3 was actually a version in 7.62x39, potentially made for Finland when they were thinking about getting a new rifle in the late 50s, early 60s. Of course, they went with the Valmet, so that never was produced. The -4, though, was. In fact, it was adopted by Chile, and it was a lighter weight version with a shorter barrel, just under 20 inches, wood stock, and in 7.62 NATO, commonly known as 308. And some of these kits appear in America from time to time. But that was really their only major export success. The -5 was made in 30-06 for Mexican trials, but never went anywhere. And then there was another lightweight version, the Dash 6, that was actually for Swiss trials in the 1980s. It never went anywhere. But we did have semi-autos made. Of course, Swiss military guns could be converted to semi-auto once the soldier mustered out and wanted to purchase his rifle. These were called PE-57s, as they had the selector limited to semi-only and a few minor changes to limit them. There was also a factory-produced PE-57, a little bit different. And of course, there was the more famous in America, AMT, American Match Target Rifle, which was in 7.62 and 8.0 30-06. And it would have wood furniture and pretty different arrangement, honestly, but it's still the same action and still very fine Swiss quality. All told, even though these were pretty expensive to produce, Sig would turn out over 700,000, ending the production line, well, officially in 1983, although in practice they kind of quit making most parts in the 70s, so the ones they assembled in the 80s were usually built just on existing parts to kind of use them up. And these would be standard issue in the Swiss military up until the early 90s. And of course, since Switzerland never fought a war, they were, like the other ones we've seen today, not used in that. But Chile would use them occasionally for various minor things. So technically, the SG 510 has seen some type of active combat, even if it was maybe a bit of an irregular situation. And with that, let's get in to the present day. And it's in yet another video. But to be fair, for what these cost, and if you had one, you'd probably have a lot of videos too. Now, I'll try not to repeat too much. I'll just have it in here as kind of context for the evolution from the Schmidt-Rubin to what we have here. The SIG SG 550 Sturmgewehr model of 1990. Also firing GP90. Well, a century's difference. 5.6mm GP90, not 7.5mm GP90. I don't think if you put that in this gun that would do so well. Never really could find a Swiss mag pouch for this gun, so got this neat FAO pouch here that holds two clipped together very well, so yeah. And of course this would replace this. And there are some general similarities. Really, as soon as the new 223 letter 5.56 NATO cartridge hit the scene in the 1960s, SIG was interested in it. And they partnered with Beretta, or Beretter, as many of you like me to say it. This would result in the SG 530, which had a gas piston, but still had a roller-delayed system for its bolt. And it was kind of over this bolt system that Beretta and SIG would eventually part ways in 1968. Turns out Beretta was right. They wanted to go to a rotating bolt, kind of AK style. They would develop their gun into the AR-70, and then later the AR-70-90. SIG would go on to create the SG 540, using a long stroke gas piston and two lug rotating bolt, so very AK style, at least in concept. And then, in the 1970s, the Swiss military expressed an interest in replacing the Stgw 57 and finally replacing the 7.5 cartridge with a smaller high velocity round. So after military service of nearly 90 years, in 1979 they laid out specifications, and SIG's response was a modification known as the SG 541, which was a 20 some odd inch rifle, and the SG 5.43, which is a 14 some odd inch carbine. At that time, they ordered both a carbine and rifle. It also needed to be accurate out to at least 300 meters, select fire, and cheaper and faster to mass produce than previous guns. And SIG's main competition came from Bern with their gun known as the C-42. And in 1983, the Swiss military, after trying out several cartridges, including some homegrown ones, selected essentially a lightly modified 5.56 NATO, known as 5.6 by 45. It was a 63 grain projectile, although some were 69 grain for different loadings. And the reason they did not want to just straight up adopt the NATO cartridge was they were still maintaining neutrality, and of course they just wanted their independence. And shortly after, the SIG SG541 would be selected over the Bern offering. But then economics got in the way. There were some budgetary cuts and whatnot, and some bureaucratic delays. So even though it was scheduled to go into service earlier, it did not. This actually gave them time to develop the 541 into the 550 here. It went to a new stainless steel gas system for better corrosion resistance. They introduced a new, more durable skeletonized folding stock, and they introduced a new 4-way selector, safe, single, 3-round, and auto, and several other smaller changes to boot. Finally, in 1986, the first rifles were sent to the Swiss Army for testing and trials. And even though they originally were interested in what they considered a headquarters carbine, the 5.43, which became the 5.51, they really didn't purchase them, as best I can tell. I think they kind of just consolidated on the rifle here. And then after a couple of years of testing and trials, it, along with its cartridge, were both officially adopted in 1990, though both had been in service for a few years already. Hence the Stgw 90 and the 5.6 millimeter GP 90. So we have a side folding stock as standard. It clips onto the handguard here. It is synthetic, but it does have a metal skeleton inside. We have a polymer pistol grip with storage compartment. We have a folding trigger guard. We have polymer handguards. Like the Stgw 57, we have a single piece barrel with integrated flash hider. This is about 20.8 inches long. Has the same style of bayonet lug as the previous gun. Ring for grenades. Now this has fixed sights, not folding. One thing they changed from the SG540 to the SG550 was they went to lower profile sights. It was felt that if they made them low enough profile, they wouldn't need to make them folding. And of course they went to the diopters in the back. They also have a scope mount available to go on the top. 2-position gas regulator for standard or adverse conditions, because they were worried about going to the gas system versus the roller from before. And we have an upswept reciprocating rubber coated cocking handle, and we have an AK style mag release. The mags themselves have studs on the side to be clipped together, and standard was 20 rounds, and they're made of all polymer. And typically, at least in the beginning, they only issued 2 per soldier. Now this gun is made primarily with stamped and welded steel, upper and lower, and they actually started using a good bit of casting to save on production costs. We still have flip-up night sights though, and they have very good sights besides. And much like with the gun before, even though they tried to keep it down in the cost department, their rigorous standards and whatnot meant that this is about the most expensive, or the most expensive 5.56, or rather 5.6 caliber standard issue mass produced rifle in the world. So kind of the same thing. Again, imagine if they didn't try. Imagine if they went for machined parts in less stampings, how much it would be. Overall length is noticeably shorter at about 39 inches. And while this is not a light rifle, it is at least lighter than the Stgw 57 at just over 9 pounds with an empty magazine. So pretty good weight savings from over 12 pounds. Even if 9 pounds does seem exceptionally heavy by today's standards, honestly, for a piston gun with a over 20-inch barrel and integrated bipod, it's not so bad, frankly. Back over for a second, you saw how the Stgw 57's sling could be unclipped. This too has a clip here, but it's simplified. It's just a bent wire hook. Unclip that, and then it'll stretch out to a longer length for easy deployment. And these are the early slings with the pigtail curlicue on them. And like before, here it is on its bipod. I'm not going to say this is the best bipod. It's really not. It's a compromise. It's in the front, it doesn't go front to back, but it is easy to remove from the lower handguard without tools. So if you don't want it there, pull it off. And it is quite lightweight. And when folded, it's very flush with the handguard. Again, our flip-up night sights here. And so on and so forth. Yeah, basically they would issue these, at least they would mandate that every soldier would have 2 mags with a minimum of 40 rounds on hand in their house. And the simple idea was that would be enough to get them to a local neighborhood kind of meeting point and depot for orders and to collect more ammo and supplies. So basically the 40 rounds were just to get you from your house to your assigned meeting point in case Switzerland were invaded. So the initial guns, we had of course the 5.50, like I said. We also had the 5.51 with a 14.3-inch barrel, carbine, which has of course been mass produced, but it has been mostly used by police. And there are many other variants besides. And you know, we have the 5.50 sniper we recently did a video on, again for police. We have the 5.52, the 5.53, and in the 21st century the line has only expanded further. However, the Swiss military has really only adopted a handful of model variants, and most of those in relatively small numbers, except for of course this gun here. So while the Stgw 9D is the standard issue rifle, the Swiss Army, the Swiss military, has purchased some of the shorter commandos for specialist use. For example, with the paratroopers, some reconnaissance units, I believe some MPs or other kind of law enforcement type units, and just generally speaking specialists that need a small gun. And they've actually purchased quite a few different ones, all in pretty small numbers. They did adopt the original commando, the SG 5.52, with its 8.9-inch barrel. It had the compacted gas system, and the 5.52 was unique in that it had the recoil spring behind the bolt group, not in front of it, which necessitated quite a few changes. But that's just kind of what SIG in the 1990s had to do to make it work. Apologies for the brace on this one. It's America. That was adopted as the Stgw 04. But after SIG sold off, spun off its firearms division, and that became Swiss Arms Neuhausen, SAN, they would go back to the 5.52, which had a lot of promise but some problems, and was a very popular model, and come up with the 5.53 here, which was basically a miniaturized 5.50, 5.51 operating system, again with the recoil spring in the front. And this would be adopted by the Swiss military as the Stgw 07. And on top of that, SAN would make conversion kits to turn your old, dated 5.52 into the much more durable and dependable 5.53. And when the military did that, they would be redesignated as the Stgw 04/07. And most 5.52s in Swiss government ownership have been converted, although some have said a few are still awaiting that. But it seems like today they're either 04/07s or just 07s. But we're talking in small numbers, guys, not thousands upon thousands as we would with the PE90. Speaking of PE90, yeah, they, of course, have the semi-auto here as the PE90, just like the PE57 before it. And they've done some automatic versions of all the other versions. Of course, we've talked about so many in other videos, I don't want to ramble on here. I don't have the 5.51 LB out because it's not, strictly speaking, Swiss military, although it is Swiss police. And of course there are newer versions like the SG750 and SG751 and 7.62 NATO as well. There's even a 50 cal variant in this family. And newer guns have gone away from the traditional diopters and gone to a welded pick rail with a folding front diopter sight or a folding blade. And the rear sight, rather than being folding, is actually just clamped onto the rail. And what they'll typically do is the soldiers will have an optic, maybe an aim point or an ACOG or an EOTech or what have you. But if it goes down, they remove it quickly, and then they keep this rear diopter in a neat little pouch because this is still Switzerland, and they pop it on. Barrel lengths can either be the 8.9 inch with removable muzzle device. Old guns had the 3-prong here and were threaded 14 millimeter. Newer guns have a bird cage and are threaded half by 28. There's also the LB variant, which has a 13.7 inch barrel, and that has an integrated flash hider like on the full rifle. There's also a 11.9 inch barrel LB with a removable bird cage, so they have options. And as for the lower, they still are doing some steels, but just recently the Swiss military, the Swiss government, accepted the new alloy lower, which SAN has been doing for about 10 years. So probably we'll see the steels, the stamped steels, phased out in favor of the new alloy, which is better, easier to machine with modern 21st century techniques, and does save a bit of weight on an otherwise chunky gun. And then finally, the newer butt stocks, if this had a stock on it, rather than being a fixed folder, are a 3-position folder. And modern furniture can be either green or black, and they do specialize colors as well. And here's a modern 30-round mag, although 20s are still standard in the Swiss military. And that's where we sit. Guns like this can be under 30 inches long, depending on the variant. They can be under 8 pounds, again, depending on the variant. And still have the reliability and dependability of the full rifle. In fact, in my experience, most other 8, 9, 10-inch barrel guns out there do sacrifice a lot for reliability. But these Swiss guns, they are now back to being known as SIG, AG, as of 2020, seem to really still keep that standard. And newer guns like this one can even have a 4-position gas regulator, which is great for suppressor use. And the Swiss military definitely uses these with suppressors, although older suppressors meant for the single-piece barrel are not optimal, but, needs must and all of that. So the family has been generally successful for SIG, SIG, and is still in production today. While the Swiss Army, I should say, got enough Stgw 90s several years ago, they're still making these for export, police use, and again, specialist use in the military. And to date, they've produced well over 600,000, and with an uptick in sales recently, that number might climb more than you would think. And it's still the modern issue Swiss service rifle into 2020, and it does not seem like they are going to be retiring it or the 5.6 GP90 anytime soon. And yet again, we've completed another collection. And it's really interesting to see how so much carried through. I mean, the basic Schmidt action existed from 1888 until really 1933. A couple of modifications along the way, but yeah, it stuck around for a very long time because it worked. Likewise, the Rubin cartridge, if you want to basically consider 7.5 GP90 and 7.5 GP11 to be just an extension of themselves, much like people do with the the Swedish cartridge, 6.5 Swede, round nose versus Spitzer, not a whole lot of difference is made. But with that change, aside from that, the cartridge itself existed, basically 100 years. At least in frontline military service, beginning with the Schmidt-Rubin and running through the Stgw 57. That's really a testimony to how advanced it was. It was a small diameter cartridge, it was a rimless round, and while the GP90 had a few odd things that dated back to black powder, like the patch, the GP11 was a truly modern round for, 1911, even though the round itself really dated back even a few years earlier. So they were certainly ahead of the curve there. And while the K-31 may appear to be only in frontline service briefly, truth is they were still very active through the 70s and are still extremely well respected today. And they're really the pinnacle, or at least one of the pinnacles of bolt-action military-style guns, kind of alongside things like the Mauser Model 1898. Yeah, I would actually argue also the British P14, which is a gun I particularly like. But moving from there into the modern guns, they continue to do their thing, making them highly modern, at least relatively speaking, but also very accurate and kind of heavy and very expensive. Yet they have found a place in the modern world, and even though the Stgw 90 cost them a lot to equip an army with in the 80s and 90s, they're still going strong today, and the maintenance cost, the replacement cost of parts is quite low. Sure, they have to replace the stocks and bipods and springs and firing pins like that, but the receivers, the trunnions, and even the barrels have an exceptionally long lifespan, at least compared to things like the M16 and even the AK-47 AKM. So it'll be interesting to see how long the Stgw 90 stays in service. And thanks to guns like the 5.52, 5.53, and upscaled like the 7.51, we can see that the platform is quite versatile. And while some don't necessarily like newer features like the alloy lower, I actually think it's a good progression. And fit and finish is quite high and whatnot. Now the thing to remember with all of these, while they are exceptionally well made, they are still military rifles. They were designed for mass production. They were designed to be kind of soldier-proof, easy to maintain. To that end, while the triggers are nice on the bolt guns, they maybe are not as nice as a sporting gun. The Stgw 57 is just heavy. And the newer guns, while they are well built, they do intentionally have some play between the parts, upper to lower, or maybe handguards, because you don't want a military gun that's too tightly fit. If you start applying commercial standards like that to a gun like these, you're going to have less reliability, and it's going to be harder for a soldier to maintain in the field. Plus, you want a gun that's parts interchangeable. You don't want a gun that requires fitting of parts each time, and if you get something too tight, that's exactly what you end up with. So yeah, I'm just trying to say, be realistic about these. You know, people talk about how great they are, and they're not wrong, but keep in mind they were all built expressly for military use. But yeah, like I said at the beginning, with a lot of new imports from JDI at the end of this year, after waiting a long time, and since I've been doing these collection overview videos, I thought, why not do one on Swiss guns? And I'm sorry there's not really much new here, but hope you at least found it a little entertaining and enjoyed hanging out with me for a while. Love to hear about your own K-31s. There's some interesting variants in those because of how many are in the USA. And these are a lot of fun to collect. And 7.5 GP11 is quite gettable, although 7.5 GP90 not so much. And the newer 5.6 GP90 is imported in small numbers, but of course these guns will shoot 5.56 NATO, 62 grain or what have you, so it's not like you're limited to it. So, any questions or comments, please post them below. And please, if you could, check out some of our other videos. And if you'd like to help support the channel, check out the link to our Patreon page. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time.